It's 6:30 now.
6:30 now.
Still 6:29.
Well, first of all, I want to thank all of you for turning out. I know that in the middle of a summer weeknight, there's plenty of other things you could be doing, but I really appreciate you being here tonight. And I'll go through the course calendar, but this is the first of 6 sessions. There'll be 3 sessions in June and then 3 sessions in July after the 4th of July break. So I've had already several questions, polite questions, asking me what possessed me to offer a course on Dante, and especially on the Divine Comedy. I want to tell you several things possessed me. And I already mentioned at the dinner table that this year, 2014, is the 700th anniversary of the composition of the first part of the Divine Comedy, which is the best known, the Inferno, or Hell. And so scholars all over the world, both literary scholars and scholars of political history, are really marking this year, because it is a banner year in the life of this particular work. So I was thinking about this, and I was thinking if we were in a university and this was a college class on West European literature, that would be one thing that would cause us all to gather here. If we were on the same university campus, but we were in a historical politics class, that we would have another reason for convening. And if we were in a seminary and we were doing a class on historical theology, that would be yet another reason for us to be gathered here. So what I'm pointing at is that the Divine Comedy has a lot of qualities to it, and a lot of features that are worth studying. It could be the literary art. It could be theology. It could be political history. But the reason that I decided to offer this course is because I believe for the current age, this story of a pilgrim's journey has a lot of relevance to our journeys of faith. In other words, so I'm looking at this as a devotional exercise. We're going to touch on history, and we're going to touch a little bit about the literary quality, and we definitely will be drawn into some of the theology. But the main thing I'm looking at this as is a devotional walk for all of us. Trying to understand if there are connections and meaning and significance between what Dante described himself of his own pilgrimage and faith and the ones that we all walk. So that is my motivation. And you know, there are literally dozens of contemporary books that talk about the path of faith. How do modern Americans walk the path of faith? And I could have used any one of those books to offer a similar course. The virtue I find in approaching it from this perspective is that it's in some senses alien to us. We can pretty well predict what we're going to hear from contemporary authors writing about paths and trials of faith. I'm thinking, though, that some of the oddities that we're going to encounter in the Divine Comedy are going to provoke us to think a little bit differently. We may come out at the same place, but we may have been shaped in a different way along the way. So those are some of my hopes. This poem, 14,000 verses of it, of which we will read about 1/1000th, because we would have to have a year-long course if we were actually going to go through the 3 sections of the Divine Comedy in detail. But we're going to choose enough from each of those 3 areas, hell, purgatory, and heaven, to get a good sense of what Dante was talking about, and also to reflect, I think, back on what we think of those things. We are going to encounter some great themes here. This is appropriate. This is a church setting, so we will start off. We are going to encounter God. Okay? We are going to, as I've been saying, going to encounter human struggles in faith. We are going to encounter sin, and hopefully, by the 6th session, we will have encountered redemption. But as we're going to find out next week when we actually get into the text of the poem, Dante, the character that he's writing about, which is himself by name, at the very beginning of the poem, he wants to take a shortcut to heaven, okay, from where he is, where he begins. He wants to take a shortcut. And what he finds is that it is not God's way or God's will for people to take shortcuts to heaven. That we each walk a path, hopefully, that concludes in heaven, but we don't start in heaven. And we go through a number of trials and tribulations and challenges in our lives that sometimes cause us to believe or to think that there is no heaven and that there is no God. But the point is, he learns early on that there are no shortcuts to come before God. It requires devotion and focus, hope and faith, as we've been told by our own scripture for many, many years. Okay, so the literary appeal of this work, I'm going to touch on that. I will tonight talk especially about some of the historical background, because it's very important. If we launched right into the poem, right away we would be over our heads in historical detail for which very few of us have any connection, any background at all. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. But as I said, the real thrust of the Divine Comedy is that it is a moral epic. And that's the one thing I'm going to constantly bring up. As well as it's not only a moral epic in the sense that it brings up all the great issues of a life of faith and of the journey of faith, but it's a moral epic in the sense that it also accounts for individual encounters in faith. Each of the 3 parts, hell, purgatory, and heaven, consist of chapters which are called cantos. And so again, when we get into the poem, we'll go into a little bit of the structure and why it's structured that way. There's a very definite purpose, and each section reflects the other sections. They're almost all of identical length, which is quite an accomplishment for something that is 14,000 verses long. And everyone, just here an early insight, every one of the sections, all the 3 sections, they all end with the word stars. Because in each case, whether it's hell or purgatory or heaven, what Dante is trying to draw our attention to is something that we very seldom focus on, which is the heavens. So again, I'll come back to the reasons for what this is. The journey described in the poem takes place over 3 days. And it begins on Good Friday in the year 1300. And it goes from, and over the next 3 days, it begins, of course, as you well know, in hell. Then on what we call Holy Saturday, we're in purgatory. And then finally on Easter Sunday, Dante tells us how it is that he emerged into heaven on the day of the resurrection. So that's the sort of the trajectory. It's anchored at a particular point in time, in a given year, 1300, and it begins on Good Friday. And again, when we get into the details of each of these sections, you'll see why that was so important to Dante to have this calendar reference. Okay, so we're going to be exploring the Divine Comedy, and we're going to be doing it in 6 sessions. There's our opening logo. And as I said in my first email about this course, it's the best known verse in the entire poem. Abandon all hope, ye who enter here. And of course it has a demon who's holding up. And this is what Dante and his companion Virgil, whom I'll describe in more detail next week, this is what they encounter as they approach the gate to hell. That is the verse that they find inscribed over the gate. And unfortunately, I think by the time we come to the end of this course, we will find that while it's an important part of the overall story, it is not the most important part. Okay, so this is going to be broken down into 6 sessions. Tonight we'll do some introductions, time, place, and poet. Next week I'm going to talk a little bit more, try to put this in, try to lift up the contemporary significance of this poem today. So why should we care? And you know, I'll touch on that tonight, but I really want to sort of lift up some very specific themes that are contemporary to our lives that I think we'll find reflected in the poem. The next week, June 29th, or the 26th, we will begin the descent with Dante and with Virgil into hell. How many of you have seen descriptions, little snippets from Dante's hell? Okay, they're very memorable. It is, by the way, literature that deals with hell, Milton wrote a very famous poem called Paradise Lost. And he also wrote a later poem called Paradise Regained. Nobody remembers Paradise Regained. Everybody remembers Paradise Lost. Because for some reason, hell fascinates us. And the encounters that Dante talks about in hell are some of the most graphic, gritty, even disgusting things that you will ever see in a work of what would otherwise be called high literature. This ain't high literature. This is barnyard literature in many respects, and especially in hell. We will begin the descent into hell on the 26th. Then the 10th will be right in the pit. We'll be right in the depth. I think probably most of you know that there's a particular architecture to Dante's hell. It's 9 circles, and each circle, it begins at the broadest circle where the most population of hell lives, and it becomes progressively narrower until the most despicable of people are found in the 7th, 8th, and 9th rings of hell. And who do you think is at the very bottom of this cone?
Satan.
Satan. All right. Now, but this is a good place to point out that unlike most of the notions that people these days have about hell, if they think about hell at all, hell is not ruled by Satan in this poem. Hell and purgatory are ruled by God. That what happens in hell is not Satan's punishment, not Satan's torment of people who have been cast into the pit. It is God's punishment. And Satan himself in this poem, in the 9th circle, is absolutely paralyzed. He can do nothing. He has no power. And so this is a sort of a reversal about with conventional conceptions of hell, which they think is ruled by demons and Satan himself. But that's not the case here. And again, we'll get into the reasons for that. There are very good reasons that is the case. Now, on the following week, straining for light. And by what I mean by here is one of the first things we're going to note about hell is how dark it is. I guess that's not a surprise, but I'm talking about a darkness that is not just visual. It's a darkness that pervades everything. Everything in hell absorbs darkness. So it's visually dark, it's spiritually dark, it's psychologically and physiologically dark. When after this journey, this ordeal that Dante does survive, but must go through, traversing through those 9 circles of hell, at the end of it, there's a glimmer of light. And so this of course leads to the next section, which is purgatory. Now, if hell is constructed with these concentric circles, narrowing, becoming more and more narrow until they reach the absolute pit, purgatory is the opposite. It is concentric circles moving upward. And so when he comes to the end of this landscape in hell, there's a glimmer of light. And the surroundings become increasingly light as Dante creeps out of the pit of hell and comes then up into this new realm, this new dimension called purgatory. Now, I do have to spend some time on purgatory, especially for a Protestant audience. Purgatory is something that if we had Catholic friends growing up, or maybe we were Catholic, my mother was Catholic, before she saw the light. No, I joke, of course. But purgatory, I remember as a kid, you know, with my Catholic friends, they talk about purgatory, you know, me at the time being a good Baptist boy, what are you talking about purgatory? There is no such thing. But we are going to encounter purgatory here, and we're going to get some sense of why, theologically, at least at that time, which is, by the way, about the time that the whole concept of purgatory originated, was in the Middle Ages. It wasn't an early church concept. It was something that arose out of the Middle Ages. But it served Dante's, both his poetic and his theological purposes, to have hell leading into this intermediate space, which is a good way of describing it, between hell and heaven. A space where he would argue that most of us spend our lives. Now, of course, the formal concept of purgatory is about something that happens after life. And he will talk about that as well. But he is saying that the struggle for increasing light, for decreasing the distance from God, is well described by the travails of purgatory. Okay, then the final week, we will come into the heavenly realm. And each time we make a progression from hell to purgatory to heaven, there are dramatic changes in the physical environment that Dante describes. Both hell and purgatory, in his conception, and I'll have an image that really lays this out. But both hell and purgatory, in his conception, are earthly places. Heaven is not. To go from purgatory, to make the step literally into the heavens, beyond the stars, and to be in the dimension in which God exists. That is that's the concluding part. And Dante, we will find, he goes through this entire poem, and it begins, you know, in the depths of despair for him personally, and for the reasons I'm going to touch on in a moment. But it ends, which is why, by the way, it has this word comedy, the divine comedy, meaning that it has a favorable ending. one other thing I need to point out, because the purists they hammer this home all the time. It is not the Divine Comedy. Somebody, probably 2 or 3 centuries after Dante wrote this, put on the adjective divine. He wrote it as la commedia, the comedy. That's all. So just in case you run into someone who has a background in this poem, you'll be one step ahead of them. But what he describes here, so I said that the physical environment changes constantly in whatever section of this journey he finds himself in. But when he comes to heaven, he's got to use language that is not earthbound. And here, I think, much to our surprise perhaps, we're going to find the real appeal of the Divine Comedy. We are going to encounter words that perhaps we have lacked in attempting to describe what heaven might be like. And of course, for Dante, what heaven really means in its culmination is that he finally comes face to face with his Creator. To quote St. Paul, he no longer sees things through a dark glass, but face to face. One other notable thing about the whole poem is that there aren't a lot of scriptural references. You can hear things like Paul or Revelation. You can hear Scripture in these passages, but he does very little direct citation. He cites more the classical authors of Greece, which is why Virgil, the poet Virgil, is his companion through this entire, not the entire journey, but through hell and purgatory. So it's a very interesting choice. I think part of it is biographical. He is a classically trained poet of the Middle Ages in Italy. And so he's very familiar with all of these ancient poets, and he honors their contributions to the thought that all human beings have of life and death and afterlife. But there is no mistaking that this is a Christian work. Now, it may not be well, certainly, since we live in 2014 and not in 1300, it is not the Christianity that we're most familiar with. It would be impossible. And which is one of the other things I hope is sort of a collateral benefit of this course, is that we're going to learn a bit more about our own faith, or at least our own faith as it was observed and practiced at a particular time in history. Okay, so I've gone over a few first things. I have a couple more things, but I want to pause there because I've been just fire hosing you. Is there anything that triggers questions or comments at this point? You can all walk out of the room too if you like.
I would like to know what triggered Dante to start this journey in the first place.
Yeah, I'm going to get to that.
Oh, okay.
I'm going to talk a little bit, and I'm mindful of the time, but I am going to get to that.
All right.
Yeah. Okay, a few more first things. When I first introduced this, I said, if you all want to gather around 5:30 for an optional meal, that's terrific. I just have been around the church long enough to know that meals and coursework or any activity go together well. But I also recognize that 5:30 is not necessarily a good time for many people just because of their work commitments or other things. So I'm going to circulate in the next couple of days an invitation to anyone who might want to sign up for any of those weeks to take the lead. Not you have to provide everything, but to take the lead in organizing a very simple meal. We had chili and bread and something cold to drink tonight. That's it. And I again thank Joy for cooking this afternoon the chili, which is delicious. You might want to grab a bowl on your way out. And there are some desserts left. We want all of this gone if it's at all possible. But I will circulate, and if there's interest, I'm not trying to force this on anybody, but if there's interest in having a small gathering before the class begins, we can do that as many weeks as we want in the coming weeks. So I will circulate a sign-up sheet for that. These sessions are being videotaped, and they may have to be heavily edited, I don't know, to get out some of my more inane comments. But they are being videotaped with the idea that we can distribute them by a link on the web page or on our Facebook page, or for those who are homebound who might want to see one or more of these classes, buy a DVD. So, and again, I thank Jay for coming up with that idea. I think it was an inspired one. I've mentioned in one of my earlier emails that the translation I'm using is Clive James's 2012 translation. We were talking about this at the dinner table and mentioned that Clive James, his translation has made some of the scholars break out in hives because it's not a purist's translation. It is very much in contemporary English. So if you want to get that book, you will not need it. Because, as I said, we're only going to be doing slices of the overall poem, and I will have handouts when we get into the actual narrative. I will have handouts for everybody. But if you would like to buy James' book, it's available on a number of online sites. Lastly, questions and conversation. This is true of all the things that I teach. I really welcome them. I do not worry that they might slow down the pace of the overall class, because we will not cover, as I've already said, the comedy in its entirety. It's a given going in. So it's more important for us to view Dante's pilgrimage as having some relationship to our own pilgrimage, our own walk of faith. And if parts of this trigger questions or comments or challenges about what we're hearing and what you believe or are thinking, let's talk about it. That's the purpose of a class like this. All right. Let me give you a little bit of background about Dante himself. I want to make sure I've got all of my notes at hand. There is an artist rendering. No one really knows what Dante looked like. I don't think there were any contemporary portraits of him. But this is actually one of the better portraits, because if you go online, Google Dante in the Google Images section, you'll see some of the most horrible renderings of his face. And usually, the downturn in his mouth is much more pronounced, as though he's been sucking on a dill pickle for weeks. He does not look like a happy fellow in most of the renderings. And I think possibly one of the reasons for that is because of this. This is Dante's death mask, okay? And you can see the very severe downturn in his the elongated nose. So if an artist took this as his or her inspiration for them doing a painting, it would not come out with a very pretty picture. But it's important, I think, for us to have some image of what Dante may have looked at like. There was one physical description of him, probably written well after his death, which said that he was, for a person of the Middle Ages, a person of middling height, which means like around 5'5" or something like that, and that the features that you see there, the sort of the severe mouth and the extended nose, were commented on by an author after his death. But then anyway, there you have an image of what he may have looked like. He was born in 1265 and died in 1321. Not a bad lifespan, especially when we get into his biography and talk about what he endured during those years. But let me say a word about the year 1265. Just to give you a context outside of this particular event. The last crusade that the church, the Roman Church, launched against the Holy Land ended in 1272. Okay? Now the Crusades, that was the 9th Crusade. The Crusades had begun 200 years before. But the last one was 1272. So Dante was already 7 years old, and during his his adolescence, the Crusades were still going on. This is an important fact because it points to one of the sort of the political realities of his era, was that the world was divided, and it was almost always divided by religion. Throughout the 13th century, the 1200s,